I'm going to go back to my Hyper-V manager, and I'm going to connect to my virtual machine, RTS-DC1, and I'm going to put this in full screen. Now we're signed into our server 2022. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is verify the IP configuration. I'm going to go to local server, my Ethernet. I'm going to just click on this, and it shows me my network adapter. And when I open that, if I go to properties, TCP/IP version 4, I can see my IP address is 192.168.1.250, subnet mask, and the preferred DNS server, and all the other fields are blank. That is what we want. I'll just close those windows there. I can see the computer is named RTS-DC1. That's what we wanted. We configured those settings in the post-installation configuration of the operating system. So we're just verifying that that was actually done. Now we can install Active Directory domain services. I'm going to go to my dashboard, and there's an option to add roles and features. I'm going to click Next on the Before You Begin. For the installation type, we are using role-based or feature-based, so accept the default there. This is the server that I'm going to install Active Directory on, so we'll just choose Next. Active Directory domain services. I'm just going to select that and add features. And we are accepting the defaults for everything else. It's also going to install this group policy management console. We want that to be installed. Now, it does give us some information here. This just tells us what Active Directory domain services actually does. It says it stores info about users, computers, other devices on your network, and helps administrators securely manage this information. It does tell us under things to note, help ensure that users can still log on to the network in case of a server outage. Install a minimum of 2 domain controllers for each domain that you have. And it also says Active Directory domain services requires a DNS server to be installed on the network. If you do not have a DNS server installed, you'll be prompted to install the DNS server role on this machine. That's going to happen for us right now. Now, in our test environment, since we are just testing, we don't have to have 2 domain controllers for testing purposes, but in any production environment, you would always have a minimum of 2. I'm just going to choose Next, and we will install. The installation was successful. Now it gives me the option to promote this server to a domain controller. Now, if you were to close this window for some reason, you can go to this notifications here, the little flag at the top right, and it's going to have that promote this server to a domain controller here, so don't worry if you exit out of that window. This is why we define the Active Directory terms, domain, tree, forest, before installing, because we're asked those questions here. So this, select the deployment operation. Do you want to add a domain controller to an existing domain? This would be you adding a second domain controller if you already have a domain that's been created. We do not have one that's been created yet. Add a new domain to an existing forest. Not domain controller, but new domain. So if I wanted a child domain, this is the option you would actually choose. Add a new forest. This is what you will choose when you have absolutely nothing. And nothing is what we have right now. So I'm creating my first domain controller in my first domain in my forest. Now I'm going to name this RTS networking.local. Now, the reason I'm choosing .local, rtsnetworking.com is an actual website on the internet. It's my website. One of the issues you can have in a lab environment, if you choose a random .com name, if a website has that name, when you connect your virtual machine to the internet, it's going to resolve to the internet name at times. So then you have this basically like a split type configuration because that name belongs to a website and you have that name defined internal. That can just cause conflicts. So in a lab environment, if you think you will ever have internet connectivity, just do not use an internet compatible extension. So don't use like a .com, net, org, or any of those types of extensions. Just use something like .local that's not internet compatible, and you will never have a conflict. Now, when we discuss this in the course, I'm going to reference, .com type names, because that's almost always what you see in most environments. But for the test environment, you could make it whatever you want. .local, it could be .test. Does not matter for our environment, just we don't want to make it internet compatible. So I'm going to choose RTS Networking .local for that reason. It asks me now for these functional levels. The functional levels are just new capabilities that were introduced, and notice your only options are 2008 up to 2016. That's because at an Active Directory level, Microsoft has made no enhancements in Server 2019 or Server 2022. So both of these will stay on Server 2016. One of the main considerations for this functional level is you could never introduce a domain controller that is older than what your functional level is. But since this goes all the way back to 2016, you could have domain controllers that run Server 2016, 2019, and 2022 could all be in the same domain without any issues. You just couldn't have anything older than 2016, and no one would deploy 2012 now. So non-issue for us. Specified domain controller capabilities. This has detected that we don't have DNS installed, so it's going to automatically install it for us. It's also going to add this global catalog. We will talk about that in just a moment, but notice it is selected by default, so we're going to leave it as is. And there's an option for a read-only domain controller. That is grayed out because your first domain controller in your domain cannot be a read-only domain controller. Now, the name kind of tells you what that does. A read-only domain controller is something you would deploy to a branch office. So let's say I have headquarters in Sydney, and in some other smaller location, we have maybe 20 users in some branch office. When those 20 users log in, I don't want them to have to cross a WAN link every time they log in to authenticate to a domain controller back in Sydney. So one solution, in your branch office, you can just deploy a read-only domain controller. You can determine which user accounts, which objects get replicated to that read-only domain controller, and they can never be modified on that domain controller. So you can't create, delete, manage anything on that read-only domain controller itself related to Active Directory. So effectively, it's like a distribution point. So your users can authenticate locally instead of crossing a WAN link every time they communicate with Active Directory. In the unlikely event Active Directory were to crash and we needed to restore this, or maybe the server crashed and you're restoring, we have this Directory Services Restore Mode, or DSRM. This is the password that I can use to restore Active Directory. It is just required that you define this password. If we go next, it says a delegation for this DNS server cannot be created because this authoritative parent zone cannot be found. Okay, that sounds like a lot of technical jargon. What it's actually saying is we didn't find a DNS server on your network and we're going to create one for you. So we will just click next on that and it's going to install DNS. Then it thinks for a moment and it brings up this NetBIOS. This is going to just be your domain name without the extension, but it's going to auto-populate. So ours will just be RTS Networking. It just does not have the .local on it. If we go next, this is the path to the database folder. So this C Windows NTDS, that same path for all of your Active Directory log files, and this sysvol shared folder goes to this C Windows sysvol. We're not changing any of those paths right now. We are done. So I can click next and it's going to verify the prerequisites. Now, a consideration. That was pretty straightforward. That's all it takes to build an entirely new forest. All we actually defined were these few things here. And we accepted defaults for most of those things, but you can view a script. So this gives me a PowerShell script. So let's say you went through this in a test environment just to make sure it worked exactly the way you thought. You could simply take this script and you could run this then in your production environment instead of you actually clicking through the wizard selecting these options. Could reduce some administrative mistakes. But this is straightforward enough. Most environments, administrators would be comfortable deploying this on their own. But I'm going to choose next, and it will make sure we meet all the prerequisites. And it says we passed all of those checks. So we will install. All that will happen now is it's going to complete the installation and the server will reboot. And when it comes back online, it will be a domain controller and it will host the Active Directory Domain Services service. Then we can start creating users, computers, groups, all of those types of Active Directory objects. That is done. Now it's just going to restart the server and we will be a domain controller. The first time you restart after installing an Active Directory takes much longer than all your subsequent restarts. So it's going to apply some computer settings and quite a few other things the very first time. So this startup process after you install Active Directory, it often takes 3, 4, 5 minutes or longer the very first time. After this time, it'll start up no different than any other computer. We have rebooted successfully, and now I am up to the sign-in screen. And you'll notice it says sign in to RTS Networking. That's our domain. So I'm just going to enter my credentials. Now, one question is, what credentials are we actually using? A fun fact, when you have your server operating system, when you install the operating system, the last thing you did in the install was choose the password for the local administrator user account. That's what I did here. When you install Active Directory, it takes that local administrator account and it actually makes it here what's called an enterprise administrator. So this is going to have full control over all resources that we have in Active Directory. Even if you have multiple domains in your environment, this enterprise administrator will have full control over all of those domains. Then you have the domain administrators, which will have full control over their respective domains. So whatever password you were using to log into the server before you installed Active Directory, you're using that same password to log in now with that administrator account. And we are signed in. Everything looks exactly the same. If I go to my tools, we'll see several administrative tools that reference Active Directory. One of those is Active Directory Users and Computers, or Eid-Tech is what that's often referred to as. But this is the tool that we will spend a lot of time in. This is where I would come to create new users. So you'll see new user, new groups, computers, all those objects we would now manage directly from this Active Directory Users and Computers.